Kitsap Sun Editorial Board. We're talking with Rob McKenna, Attorney General Rob McKenna, who's running for governor. And if you guys are ready, we'll let you. Why don't you take 2 minutes, just to introduce yourself, tell us why you're running, and then we'll go into some questions.
Well, thanks, and thanks for putting the time into this process. It's obviously very time-consuming, and some newspapers have stopped doing editorial boards and interviews of candidates, and I'm really glad that you're investing the time in doing it. I think it matters to your readers, and it matters to people who get to watch this on the internet, because it really allows us to get into more of an in-depth discussion about the issues of the day, including issues that are, of specific concern to your readers, which I'm looking forward to talking about. I think this election is about big issues. It's about our economy and one of the nation's highest unemployment rates. It's been very, very high for a long time. It's about what we can do to encourage small businesses to grow and hire more people in a state which is one of the most expensive states in America in which to run a company and employ people. It's also about our schools and our kids. Here we are after 28 years of one-party control of the governor's office, and we're under a court order to do what we've always known we're supposed to do, which is to adequately fund our public schools. We've got a higher education system which has been cut so much that middle-class families are finding themselves more and more pressed to even afford a college or university education, and we actually are spending less on our four-year universities now than we did 20 years ago, which is staggering, and especially today with the economy demanding people with more skills. And we've got a state government which never seems to get out of deficit. They took multiple special sessions and a regular session just to adopt a supplemental budget in 2012, and they're still forecasting deficits, even though they're also projecting 8% growth in revenues in the next biennium and 36% growth in state tax revenues over the next 8 years. Families aren't expecting their incomes to go up 36%, and most companies aren't expecting their revenues to grow by that amount. And yet the state government, the leaders are saying, well, we still don't have enough money, we need higher taxes. So these are the issues. And in terms of how we approach these issues, I think you're offered a very strong contrast, a very clear choice in this election for governor between myself and former Congressman Inslee. For example, on the approach to how we create jobs, he keeps talking about how he's going to create jobs and how he's going to expand state government to create a new Office of Economic Competitiveness, hire people into the governor's office to oversee different sectors of the economy, hand out tax breaks to favored industries. Very much a top-down approach. If you read his jobs plan, it's quite striking. But what he doesn't say in his jobs plan is that we need the reforms that are the centerpiece of my approach. What I'm saying is, listen to the business owners themselves. What are they telling us? They're saying we're one of the most expensive states in America in which to employ people. We have some of the highest unemployment insurance costs, some of the highest workers' comp costs, very heavy regulatory burden, and of course the B&O tax, which is the only, or just about the only state-level gross receipts tax in America. All of those areas cry out for reform, and if we could reform them, we can lower the costs for doing business in the state and make it possible for companies to hire more people and reduce our unemployment rate. The other area of very strong contrast is in education. The people surrounding Congressman Inslee and supporting his election are the people who brought us to where we are today. They're the authors of the status quo. They oppose real reform and innovation in how we deliver public education, and they keep saying we can't fund our schools adequately without tax increases, even though, number one, it's the paramount duty of the state, and number two, we are not only going to see another $11 billion in tax revenues, but we've seen a $15 billion increase in tax revenues over the last couple of decades, even while education has been shrinking in the state budget as a share of the state budget. Again, very, very clear contrast between the two of us. I think we need to prioritize education, that we must do it, and that if we had simply maintained education's share of the budget over the last couple of decades, we wouldn't be under court order today. There'd be $4 billion more available today for K-12 and higher ed if we had simply maintained education in its share of the budget which it enjoyed 20 years ago. So that's one area of contrast. The other area of contrast on public schools is innovation and reform. We have got to start paying our teachers more when they're great, pay them for performance. In fact, I think all public employees ought to be paid based on performance, not just based on how long they've had their jobs. And we need to give those teachers stronger support from school principals who are not just administrators but are actually instructional leaders in the schools. We need to take some of the money that comes from giving education a larger share of the budget and invest it in smaller class sizes for the primary grades, K, 1, and 2 at least. And we need to fund early learning. You know, there are almost 20,000 poor, very low-income children in our state who can't even get into Head Start or the state Head Start program, ECAP. So those are areas of contrast. I've laid out a very specific plan, and you see a spreadsheet in front of you that I can walk you through later if you'd like, that says here's how we do it. We do it by saying we're going to prioritize our schools, we're going to take that growth in the state budget, and we're going to give a lot of it to education, more than its proportionate share, until we get those numbers up where they need to be. That means that the rest of the state budget can't grow as fast. It can still grow, but not as fast. And that's what we need to do if we're going to, in fact, reprioritize our public schools and restore funding for higher ed. And the final area of contrast, and the final huge issue in this campaign, is philosophy of government itself. I believe that we need to change state government from a bureaucratic institution that is obsessed with seniority and work rules and the status quo, and convert it to a high accountability, high productivity organization where people are paid for performance, they're rewarded for it, they're held to account for it, but they're engaged and empowered in constantly improving the office. This isn't hypothetical for me. I've actually done this stuff for the last 8 years. I've led an agency of more than 1,000 legal professionals. We have the highest morale of any large agency in state government, according to the Department of Personnel. We're leaner and more productive than ever before. As of last fall, I had 14% fewer employees than I did 4 years before, fewer employees today than I did when I became Attorney General. But we have the highest morale, we're more productive, we're leaner, and that's because I took a top-down management system and I inverted it. And we've engaged and empowered every single person in my office in the improvement of the office. We reward them for helping improve it. And we work together to achieve our vision of being the best public law office in America. I want to talk more about that as the opportunity arises, but let me just say, I think every agency of state government ought to be shooting to be the best at what it does in America. I not only think that's possible, because we've got great state employees who will help make it possible, I think it's what the state of Washington, what its people deserve. I think that's where we ought to be headed. So we can talk more about the details of how we get there, because the changes I'm going to make that will get us there will not be applauded by some of the special interest groups that are defending the way things are done now. The ones who oppose pay for performance, the ones who oppose getting leaner and more productive by shrinking the state workforce, the ones who oppose competitive bidding. They don't like any of this stuff, even though it's written into state law. They don't want it to be utilized, so we'll talk about that. But again, I look forward to answering your questions about a range of issues, including transportation and whatever else is on your mind, and thanks for the opportunity to be here.
Let's start with that one. Let's talk about ferries, because that's the one
Sure.
that's really unique to us over here. They've already done one revision on what's projected for next year, taking off the table,
Right.
possibly canceling one of the routes that's specific to Bremerton. But give us maybe a more holistic view about how you handle working with WSF and where the future of this is going to go.
Well, first of all, I think the rest of the state needs to understand what your readers and you already get, which is that the ferry system is part of our highway system. It is, in fact, the marine highway system. And therefore, it needs to continue to receive its share of support from State Department of Transportation revenues. Obviously, fares will always be a feature of that. And ferry riders pay a lot of the cost of this part of our highway system. They pay, what, about 70% of the operating cost anyway. Every year, they're threatened with runs being canceled. They're threatened with very high ferry rate hikes. Here's what I'm going to do. Number one, we're going to stabilize ferry fares. Because we have to remember that when you raise fares, you also drive down ridership. And some of those riders get on the roads instead, and our roads are pretty crowded already. Number two, we're going to include funding for ferries in a statewide transportation package that I bring out to the voters with the legislature in my first or second year in office, depending on how fast we can get the legislature to move. We have to make another round of investment in our transportation system. The ferries are an integral part of that system. They'll be in the picture, in the mix. So will counties and cities. They haven't seen an improvement in the revenues they receive from the gas tax in a long, long time. And they need more help to maintain the streets and arterials that feed into the ferry system, into the highway system. So that's part of the picture as well. We'll also include a component for transit for the big urban areas because they can't function effectively without transit, and they need to continue to invest in transit. So we'll put together a balanced package that also features investments in freight mobility, and congestion relief, and preservation, safety, and maintenance. We'll bring it out to the voters for their consideration because that's how we fund transportation by and large, is we put together these packages and ask the voters to consider them.
Let me ask you a few specifics. When you say stabilization for fares, what is stabilization?
Well, fares should, fare increases should be held to no more than CPI as much as possible so that they don't outstrip the ability of people to pay them. And they have been, of course. We've seen significant increases in ferry fares for walk-ons.
And they jump, but then they've settled, and they've jumped, and things like that.
It'd be better, it would be better to create stability so that we have predictability. That means we also, of course, need to work very hard on improving ferry operations and looking for ways to contain costs and so forth. One area to do that is the same area that all of state government needs to address, and that's healthcare costs for state workers. It's amazing but true that we now spend more on health insurance for government workers than on the entire higher education budget. And one way to bend that curve is to follow the lead of other large employers, including other states, and to move more people into consumer-directed health care plans, which just finally became available to us last fall, and feature lower premiums, high deductibles, and a health savings account to fund the high deductibles. They work, of course, because people look at the money in their health savings account as their money. The state of Indiana has reported saving about 11% a year on health insurance for their workers. For us, that would be roughly $150 million a year. And they're getting better results because, of course, when people look at it as their money, they behave differently. They start asking for more generic drugs as alternatives to more expensive prescription drugs.
Let me get back to fares just a second. You said, talking about a transportation, a bigger plan coming up. Do passenger-only ferries fit in that at all?
I haven't gotten down to that level of detail yet. I certainly see the value of passenger-only ferries. I don't know what the need will be there in the package as opposed to maintaining them in base funding to the extent they're in the base. So that's something we would need to sit down and work with stakeholders on, frankly. To me, transportation is about customer service, it's about market share. Too often transportation agendas are hijacked. Transportation is hijacked by other agendas, whether someone's trying to do something else. To me, transportation, when it's provided by the public through transit or ferries or whatever it is, it's operating in a market. And if our goal is to get more people to use transit or take the ferry instead of driving, we need to think about how we increase our market share. So that's how I would look at passenger ferries. They can definitely be a wonderful addition or continuation in the fleet, but how do they fit in that larger picture, and where's the market?
Okay, and how do you feel about the current law which keeps all of the shipbuilding within Washington State?
Well, it's a good principle, and at the same time it has to be balanced against cost. I mean, what's the premium we're paying for keeping the work entirely in state? If it's a reasonable premium, then it's probably worth doing.
What's reasonable to you?
I don't know, 10%. I'm just picking a number out of the air. We'd have to sit down. But when you're paying much, much more, you're incurring a huge opportunity cost, and then you have to think about what it costs for each of those jobs that you've just created in the state. I'd rather put our maritime builders or shipbuilders in a position to be even more competitive in soliciting work beyond the ferry system. That's what a lot of them would like to do. They'd like to not have to rely on ferry work if that's in fact what they're relying on today.
And then the last question on transportation, you mentioned gas tax and how that's all going to fund all of these things that we want to do, but there's also
it's not only gas tax.
There's also a trend of it declining, and so what should the state be doing to think about how we also supplement that and how transportation gets paid for here? Should we change that system?
Yeah, so I don't know what the exact mix of revenues will be, first of all, but we understand that the gas tax is shrinking in its ability to support transportation investment for all the reasons that you know about and I know about, efficient cars and fewer miles traveled, et cetera. So we're going to be continuing to look at tolling. That's going to be in the mix, just like it is right now for 520 and for the Narrows. We ought to be looking at ways to attract private capital to help fund some of these costs. So I think it's time to revisit the concept of public-private partnerships, which was, of course, on the table in the 80s and 90s until the legislature basically walked away from it, even from the Narrows, which was the last P3 project before it was stopped by legislative leadership. We need to be thinking about a mix of funding, because we know that there's no one source that's going to get it done for us. And I think in this package, in the next couple of years, it'll be that traditional mix of sources.
Well, you seem committed to putting a tax passage out there in the next year or two.
Yeah.
That you've already said that. So, if you put it up for the voters, you pretty well know what's going to happen. You're going to have to make a pretty good case. Right. What happens if they vote it down? How are you going to fund transportation? If you're committed to funding it only through a tax package.
Well, you know, you have to fund your investment package, and so the voters need to see what the cost is and what the investments are. And I've had conversations with legislative leaders about this, and I've been involved in packages before in my 20 years in you know, either as a volunteer or as an elected official around transportation issues. And the answer is that if the voters reject it, you reconfigure it, you go back and have them take another look at it. Sometimes it takes more than once. But I think if we put a good package together at the beginning, that voters intuitively understand why it's necessary to make these investments, and they're more likely than not to approve them because they understand the money is committed to those projects. It can't be diverted. It's not open-ended, and they understand how it benefits themselves, whether it's reducing their own commute length, or at least making it more tolerable, or it's helping protect the security of their job by helping us to grow the economy. So I think we owe it to the voters to give them an opportunity to vote up or down on that investment set.
Do you think you can get, I'm going to tie two of the things you're kind of talking about, and I want to know how you would work with your own delegation if you were elected.
Mm-hmm.
With Republicans in the House and the Senate right now, the levy swap that you're talking about, that's been in the news, with,
yep.
They came from the debate last week. And I understand that it's kind of a revenue neutral overall thing.
Right.
But there's certain cities would see property taxes go up under this statewide plan. Do you think that's going to be a hard sell to the Republicans in the caucus?
Well, there are two authors of that idea. One is the Democratic budget writer in the House, Ross Hunter, and another is Joe Cirelli in the state Senate, the Ways and Means chairman or ranking member. And they're simply pointing out an obvious fact. We have been violating the Constitution and the law in state government because state legislative leaders and governors over a long period of time have shoved more and more of the cost onto local school districts that the state is supposed to be funding. The Constitution requires the state to fund basic education. So they've been effectively ratcheting up local property taxes by shifting more and more of those costs onto local school districts. They've proposed as a solution a revenue-neutral replacement of local levy dollars with the state common school levy. And a wide spectrum of people looked at that and said, well, something has to be done. And what's the alternative? Do you raise the sales tax to provide funds? This is a question that I hope you will ask Congressman Inslee, since he's vigorously attacking an idea that came from his own party and has absolutely no suggestion of what he's going to do instead. And if you look on the spreadsheet I gave you, you'll see the numbers laid out. These are cost figures generated within state government for what it's going to cost to replace the local levy down to a level of about 10%, right, from 28 down to about 10. It's in the column under levy swap. It's about the middle of the second section. It's highlighted in green. So you can see it starts at about $1.6 billion and grows to almost $2 billion to replace the levy, the local levies. This is something that is obviously not optional. The local levy dollars have to be replaced because you can't just cut them and not replace them, since we're already inadequately funding our schools at a shameful level, and we're among the bottom 5 states in per student funding for public schools. So what I've done is to include that in there as a placeholder, because I think the only responsible thing to do is to recognize there's an issue, something has to be done about it, and a bipartisan group has very thoughtfully come up with an answer. Inslee has come in and attacked this just the way you'd expect someone from Washington, D.C. to do it. This is one of the reasons, this is emblematic, it's typical of why nothing gets done in Washington, D.C. You know, Social Security is in trouble, Medicare is in trouble, deficits are a huge problem, spiraling national debt's a huge problem, and as soon as one side suggests an approach to addressing it, the other side uses it as an opportunity to attack, you know, and poisoning the well, if you will. whatever happened to Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill sitting down and figuring out how to save Social Security? Just completely absent. And Congressman Inslee has sort of reflexively brought that very approach into this debate. If you read the coverage of this issue, Democratic legislators and education advocates are just horrified that.
That's why I ask: are the Republicans going to suggest it? I'm going to support this. And how confident
the
you feel
reason I
that?
mentioned that Senator Zarelli has also come up with this idea along with Ross Hunter is to signal that Republicans understand something has to be done. And the reason I think they're proposing replacing local levy dollars with state levy dollars is the common sense point that they're the same thing from different sources. And if it's revenue neutral, you've got a fundamental equitable principle. And remember that what we're doing now is fundamentally unfair. So what this really represents is a correction of an unfairness and an unconstitutional trend that we've been seeing over the last 30 years.
Just for a point of clarification, could you explain NSGF?
Near government state fund. It just means the state general budget. In fact, it might be in the footnotes. I apologize if it's not.
I was trying to find it.
Yeah, if it's not, it's just the state general fund.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's the general fund is what. In other words, it doesn't include the transportation budget and some other things, but it's the budget you most often read about. Right now, it sits at about $31 billion per biennium.
There's a initiative about legalizing marijuana, and we had Attorney General candidates in here talk to us last week, and so we've been talking about this one quite a bit. But I guess first I would like just to know your opinion on that initiative, and also what kind of movement can be made to straighten up what's going on in the medical marijuana community. There was this series in the Seattle Times talking about a lot of loopholes, a lot of things that are not clear, what the state's role is, and what will your, I should let you go one at a time on these questions before I throw to you.
Well, first of all, on Initiative 502, I'm opposed to it for three reasons. Number one, it will inevitably lead to increased use of marijuana by young people. And I'm concerned about that because there's a lot of medical research that says that marijuana today is more powerful than it was 20 or 30 years ago, much higher THC content, and they're linking regular use of marijuana by young people to harmful effects on brain development for young people. Number two, this will jeopardize the availability of medical marijuana for people who need it for therapeutic reasons. Because the federal government has laid off of prosecuting around medical marijuana, even though it's illegal under federal law, in a kind of truce. I think all bets are off if the state attempts to be the first state to legalize the recreational use of marijuana. Number three, I think that it's really problematic to signal to Washington residents that this product is legal when in fact they could still be prosecuted under federal law. And so I'm afraid some people will misunderstand and won't realize they're jeopardizing themselves from a federal law enforcement standpoint.
Okay. So then what's are you okay with, you sound like you're okay with the medicinal use of marijuana?
I think marijuana is proven to have therapeutic benefits for people with certain illnesses. I think that people with those illnesses should have access to it. But you're right, the current law is confusing. It's very difficult for communities, for city councils,
we have it here with the business licensing that we can't get counties that are in line.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think the legislature might want to take a look at how to reduce that confusion. The Department of Health has attempted to do that by promulgating regulations, but of course they can only go as far as the law, and if the law is unclear, it's hard to write clear regulations. So there is concern that some are trying to profit from medical marijuana in ways not foreseen by the authors of the original law. And now that we've had it 10 years, maybe it's time to go back and figure out how to protect medical marijuana for people who really need it while preventing people from exploiting it commercially in ways that are bad for local communities.
Would you support the current bill if it only talked about medical marijuana?
The current initiative, you mean?
Yes. Bill initiative.
No, it's okay. I'm not sure how it would only talk about. I mean, it's pretty clearly aimed at legalizing recreational use of marijuana. I don't know how much it does to address.
But the points are in the initiative. The points are in the initiative right now. But if it only talked to legalizing the growing and distribution of marijuana for medical use.
Well, we have, of course, a legal framework for the production and distribution and consumption of marijuana for medical use. So I think it'd be easier to make any refinements to that law that we need so that it works better for people who need that product while protecting communities from commercial exploitation. That's how I would favor doing it. I don't. It's a hypothetical. I realize you're asking, but I think that could be done anytime by the legislature if it chooses.
As a former Attorney General, is this something you think is worth the governor's time, whether it's lobbying on a national level? There's this talk about changing marijuana to a Schedule II narcotic, so maybe it makes it a little easier to have medical marijuana.
So you could have it by prescription for one thing. And I think that's something that we could continue. Governor Gregoire, of course, has already made that request. Other governors have as well.
Is that something you would like to?
I'm certainly willing to look at that and devote some time to it if it makes sense. You bet.
Having just got back from Amsterdam, spending 4 days there.
No wonder you're so.
Yeah, we had this guy.
I think the federal reaction is the biggest issue, and as a physician too, by the way. And talking to people there, the fact that it's allowed and not illegal doesn't seem to be a problem in that city. And you don't see people out in the streets drugged out. It actually have less crime because people aren't, stealing money to try and go out and buy stuff illegally and so forth. I was surprised on how the local people didn't seem there was a problem at all. I was quite surprised about that. Just something for to think about in terms of the impact.
Okay.
I've heard I'm going to change gears a little bit. Christine Gregoire goes to China a lot and does these kind of trade shows and trade talks and things like that, and that's obviously a really big part of what's coming in our economy here. And I've heard the governor's job described as a state salesman, that you have to do that. Why do you think you can do that? What are you good at? What are your background in that you think you can go overseas and convince people, buy Boeing jets, buy our apples, those sorts of things?
Well, for one thing, I've lived overseas extensively. First of all, growing up, I lived overseas more than I lived in the States because my dad was stationed in Germany multiple times. He was stationed in Thailand, and when we lived in those areas, we traveled a lot. My parents loved exploring the neighboring countries. Secondly, I've lived in Asia as a young attorney on a fellowship from the Henry Luce Foundation, the Luce Scholars Program. I've been back to Asia with other AGs, leading a delegation to Taiwan last year. And have a lot of contacts in East Asia and South Asia. So I think part of it comes from understanding the territory, understanding both Europe and Asia, and having a genuine interest in it. My undergraduate degrees are in economics and international studies, both with honors and 2 separate BAs in each one, because I really am interested in the issues and have delved into them. So I think you're right that the governor needs to be the chief salesperson for our state products, and we need to look at trade missions as one tool and evaluate how effective they are versus other approaches that we might take. For example, it's been suggested to me that it might be more effective to sell products in China to open a showroom for our Washington products, because Asian consumers are like consumers everywhere. They want to feel, touch, even taste before they buy, and that would be true of people who run distribution companies and import-export companies. And it seems to me if we could fund that with contributions from the companies whose products would be shown there, as opposed to tax dollars, that might be more effective. When I was a young lawyer in Tokyo, Washington State had a little trade office there, but it was just like someone with a desk. That's not going to get you there. I think you need to have a presence, and people need to be able to come and see your products. I think we should try it on a pilot basis so that industry can see whether it works for them and whether it's worth the investment, and if it does, then we might have a model that we could take. But I think we have so much to offer that people would come and they would check out the Microsoft products, they'd check out Washington State wines and other agricultural products, as well as many manufacturers. And I think we need a more a newer, fresher approach, and not just relying on foreign trade trips.
Speaking of that, you criticized Jay Inslee earlier, saying something along the lines of chooses industries and chooses things.
Have you read his book?
Well, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. Yeah. On the same side, there is a role of government to kind of spur growth in some emerging things for our state. And what do you think is appropriate to do, or the way to do that?
I think the best thing that government can do is to invest in basic research. I mean, there's clearly a strong return on investment investing in basic research that has a long-term payoff, that you know, it's harder for a business to do because it has such a long-term payoff.
And you do it like through the universities?
Absolutely, through the universities. You know, I'm very worried about the fact that Mr. Inslee's allies have been, you know, making deep cuts to higher education that threaten the viability of our research universities, and of course, that are making it harder and harder for anyone to obtain a bachelor's degree at the very time in our history when it's more important than ever to have a BA or higher. In fact, I think it's by the middle of this decade, 2 out of 3 new jobs in our state will require at least a bachelor's degree. What I don't favor is the state government you know, deciding what the winners and losers are going to be based on political connections or popularity. First of all, government's likely to get it wrong, and not just our government. You know, our national government has a very checkered history in getting it right and picking favored industries. Other countries have tried it, including Japan, and have gotten it wrong more often than they've gotten it right. I'd rather focus on creating a level playing field in which every business has a fair chance of succeeding. You know, I mean, how many people in state government in the, say, the mid-1980s would have accurately forecast that one of our biggest growth industries would be coffee? How many would have really appreciated Microsoft's potential, or back in the day, you know, Boeing for that matter? And so there are appropriate things for us to do. Invest in infrastructure so that all of our import-export companies can have access to the ports. Invest in education. Workforce is the most important thing of all, even more than R&D. Because, of course, we are now the state which is more reliant on importing people with bachelor's degrees than any state in America. I mean, how is it that the University of Washington turns away almost 80% of its computer science applicants at the very time people are trying to get in, and companies are screaming for more comp sci grads? It just doesn't make sense. So, you know, and of course, there's the whole K-12 public education piece of this, yeah, which we should talk about, right? Yeah. Because we are underskilling our people, and it's hurting us in terms of our competitiveness, because the most important thing to any company is clearly not a one-time tax break. No one's going to hire someone because they get a one-time tax credit. What matters to them is having the talent available and being able to afford to employ that person over the long run. So address workers' comp cost, address UI cost, address the B&O tax, etc., to make it affordable to hire more people, and they'll hire more people. But secondly, make sure that people are available to hire with the skills that that company needs.
Is it worthwhile for the state to be in the alternative energy sectors at all?
Well, I don't think we should be in the alternative energy sector. I think that
maybe what's the appropriate weight for the state to kind of help those fields?
Well, we're already doing it. The current law that requires some, you know, a portion of every utility's portfolio to come from renewable, not hydro, is already having a huge effect on expanding wind power. Now we need to stop and say, okay, we've been successful. Do we really want to force public utilities to buy power they don't need? Which is exactly what's happening in Tacoma, it's happening in Vancouver and elsewhere. They're literally buying power they don't need and being forced to dump it at a big loss. So let's take a breath and say, okay, do we want to continue to require them to buy it before they need it, or maybe not? I don't think they should have to do that. So there are clearly appropriate roles, but targeted tax breaks or, you know, direct investment. You know, Congressman Inslee started the campaign by his campaign by announcing that he wants to invest more pension funds in startup companies. He then backed away from that, but of course it's an idea that he's promoted before. It's just wasn't very well thought out at all. That's not the right approach. It's also not the fair approach. Why should we pick some for special treatment over others instead of giving everyone a fair chance to be successful?
Go ahead.
Under Governor Gregoire was established the Department of Early Learning.
Yeah.
And I guess I want to find out from you, what do you see in the future for that? Where, as governor, would you take that?
Well, the Department of Early Learning is focused on improving early learning opportunities for children, whether they're in preschool or in a daycare. I think there's merit in that. They were successful under Betty Hyde's leadership in obtaining a Race to the Top early learning grant for $60 million, which was nice because overall we came in at the bottom in Race to the Top. If you recall, a few years ago, 32nd out of 36 states. So it's nice to see that Betty and her team were successful in the early learning grant. And that grant is going to be used to help integrate kindergarten education with preschool. to create common approaches and standards, to get kindergarten teachers talking to the preschool teachers. I think that's terribly important because we're a state that is, I think we rank 37th in the nation in on-time high school graduation. You know, we have a high dropout rate, and in the long run, the best way to tackle that is to invest in 3-year-olds because we have so many children coming to kindergarten woefully unprepared, and many of them never catch up.
So do you see a growth, and how would you bring that about, and what would you be focusing on?
As we devote a higher share of the state budget to public education, which is what I proposed here, some of that money will be available for early learning.
It will come down because basically when they brought that decision out, it was for public education, which does not include anything of that age.
Right, that's because basic education does not define to include preschool.
Correct.
You know, that might be something to consider in the future, but right now we're not funding the current definition of basic education. So we need to address that, and then as we focus more of the state budget on education, there should be some dollars in that available for early learning, even though it's not part of basic education.
So that would be something meaningful.
Yes, I think it's really important, absolutely.
It's along the lines of what Christine's asking, but I was just looking for your definition of early learning. We've had a lot of candidates for legislature, and we always ask, what does that mean to you? Because some people expand it, some people
start with Head Start, ECAP, preschool. So it's the 3- and 4-year-olds who are coming in. They're learning, you know, some academic skills, you know, numbers, colors, shapes, letters, and some soft skills, right? How to sit quietly, listen. Teachers who work with kids can always tell. The kindergarten teachers can always tell which kids have been to a good preschool. So it's important that we get that right. Beyond that, the definition can arguably include visiting nurse programs.
I guess that's what how far into the home should it reach?
I just consider that a very important program on its own merit. You don't have to call it early learning to support it. The return on investment for visiting nurse programs for at-risk moms is very, very high. I have estimates of 3 to 1 up to 12 to 1.
But hasn't that been cut tremendously?
There are still visiting. There has been budget pressure on them. There may have been some cuts, but we still have visiting nurse programs working with moms on TANF.
Not here.
And here.
Not much here.
There is here.
Yes, there is.
So I think
the
return on investment is very, very high. So we ought to be looking at those kinds of programs as part of a continuum, so that we then have kids who are healthy and ready for preschool, who then can go on and be successful. Right now, the estimates are that 25 to 50% of 5-year-olds come to kindergarten unprepared for kindergarten, unprepared for the work of 5-year-olds. So we do want to tackle that. Because one of the big challenges our teachers have is that kids come up to their grade and they're already way behind. And you can drill down and trace that all the way back to kids coming to kindergarten really poorly prepared.
So would that include maybe full-day kindergarten?
Yes.
Is that in the funding?
That's already in the funding. It's in my plan. We fund all-day K.
For everyone?
Yes. We don't fund preschool for every single person. That's just not in the budget. But we fund it for the poorest. We can fund it for the poorest children for sure. And we also fund a reduction in class size for kindergarten, 1st, and 2nd grade to 17 kids, because the evidence is very, very clear that that makes a difference. And I have been, like as AG, I've been in over 100 schools, and I've talked to kindergarten teachers, and I'm talking to kindergarten teachers who have 25, 26 kids. That's really tough, especially because some of those kids are going to have special needs, and some of them are going to have other challenges, and it's just crucial that we give those teachers and those kids a better chance.
How do you feel about there's a current pilot project that's doing the teacher evaluations differently? Yes. We have one of our districts that's taking part in that. You referenced it earlier that you'd like to move more in that direction. It sounds like, do you like how that one's set up, or are you talking about
I do. It's based on the Charlotte Danielson model, which is a 4-tier assessment framework. It's well established. It works. I sat down with a group of local education association reps who walked me through it. They were all from districts where this was being utilized, and I think it's the right direction. My questions for them were, number one, shouldn't we link the results to teacher pay, which is not part of it, and number two, we should have a stronger connection to student progress. In other words, the evaluation model doesn't put enough weight on whether students are actually learning or not. And I don't mean based on one test. I mean based on multiple measures of progress, because we have to recognize students or teachers in some classrooms see very high turnover during the course of the year. So we need to allow for that. We also need to make special provision for special needs kids, because you need a different metric there. But fundamentally, this is going the right direction. It needs to be taken farther, so that we pay our great teachers more because they're great, and so that we create a set of incentives to keep them in the most challenging schools. You know, because it just makes sense that you want to take your greatest teachers and by as much incentive as possible, encourage them to work with the kids with the greatest needs. You know, and instead what we typically do is the opposite of that. The University of Washington has documented that in most big school, well, in all big school districts they've looked at, the district consistently spends the least amount of money per child in the poorest school, because the money follows the adults, not the kids. And so the average teacher starts there because that's where the openings are. They get some seniority and they leave for a school with more resources to be replaced by another brand new teacher, and then that's compounded by last in, first out, which needs to be ended, which causes the layoffs of the newest teachers first, regardless of ability or energy or enthusiasm. And then we also need to reform by ending the practice of forced placement, where a principal has to take a teacher even if that principal doesn't think the teacher is a good fit. Just because they didn't work out somewhere else, it doesn't mean they should be forced onto a school where the principal really believes they're a poor fit.
Do you think charter schools need to be a part of that mix?
I do. I think 41 other states know something, and, you know, red states, blue states, but they're all big states. The only other states that don't have them are small rural states, except us. We're the only big state in America that won't allow even a single charter school. Deval Patrick in Massachusetts is busy expanding the availability of public charter schools in Boston. They're being expanded in other states because they're getting results. They're not a panacea. But they also shouldn't be a straw man for blocking education reform. They should be allowed in. I think the bill that's before the voters as Initiative 1240 is a reasonable start. And we have one advantage of being late to this, which is that we can just choose the really good charter management organizations. We've learned a lot from watching other states that haven't gotten uniformly good results. And we can avoid those errors and capitalize on the successes that the states have had.
In your first debate, you stated you were going to take or come up with $1 billion to fund education by squeezing the state budget. Your opponent, Congressman Inslee, accused you of funny math because you were at the same time you were also advocating decreasing the B&O by exempting over 100,000 businesses. Now, how do you respond to that?
What I said was that in the income tax initiative 1098, they proposed increasing the credit to $4,800 that would exempt over 100,000 businesses. I've never said that's something we could do in the short run. I said it's an example of how increasing the credit can exempt small businesses. And I've also said repeatedly that you can't increase the credit until we fund education first. But as we fund education first, then it would make sense to gradually expand the credit to exempt more small businesses that are really punished by the B&O tax.
But regardless, it's a revenue decrease. So where are you going to get the $1 billion from?
Sure,
you're going to squeeze the budget. What areas do you have targeted right now to get the money?
Well, number one, I didn't say we're going to get the entire $1 billion by squeezing the existing budget. I said we're going to do several things, including reducing overhead and administrative costs in general government, and by prioritizing the growth in the state budget, which is being forecast. The governor's office is currently forecasting $11.3 billion of new tax revenue over the next 8 years. That's a 36% increase. And that's not out of line. I mean, revenues went up 32% in Governor Gregoire's first 4 years. So projecting 36% over 8 years is in line with historical trends and with a sort of a moderate projection of economic growth. So the first thing we're going to do is what's laid out in the information I gave you today, which is we're going to prioritize public schools for that new money. We're going to limit the growth rate of the rest of government. My proposal is to limit the growth of non-education spending to 6% of biennium. So it can still grow. In some parts it will grow more than 6%, some parts will grow less than 6%, depending. But we have to have a budget, or else you'll never have enough money to put into education. And so I'm saying you take the revenue above 6%, and as you can see in the numbers I've given you, you produce a lot of additional revenue for, a lot of additional funding for public schools from that revenue. In addition to that, I think we can find savings in overhead administration. We can do that several ways. Number one, using the competitive bidding laws that already exist in the state law that allow you to open up more of what the state does to a competitive process. Not privatizing necessarily, because you don't know the private sector can give you a better deal, but opening up to a competitive process to figure out whether your own employees can give you the best deal or a private nonprofit can, or a private for-profit business can. That's in the law. We haven't been using it, and yet this is a common practice now, practice currently being extensively utilized by Rahm Emanuel in Chicago. He's using competitive, it's called managed competition or competitive bidding, to figure out, to rationalize what they're doing with city employees and what they're going to do with non-city employees under contract. A third thing we can do is to use performance management. This is also already under state law. It's available under state law. It basically is the notion that you're going to pay your workers based on performance, not just based on seniority. It became available in 2006. I was the first agency to adopt it. I mean, I adopted it as soon as I was allowed to. It allowed me to set aside part of my existing salary budget. I don't get never got any extra money for this, but part of my existing salary budget to give people performance awards at the end of the year based on what category they fell into. And of course, it works, right? That's why pretty much everyone else in the world uses incentives and doesn't just pay their workforce based strictly on seniority. We get better results, but it's not just that. It's also that we've inverted the top-down approach to management in my office, made it bottom-up. Everybody in my office is involved in improving the office. We engage and empower every single person. And then many of the best ideas we get, not surprisingly, come from our legal assistants, our paralegals, our office support staff, our IT professional. And I know that when it comes to the state budget, state employees in every agency will be able to tell us where to find savings, where to increase productivity, how to do better. If they're empowered to do so, if we ask them, if they're rewarded for doing so, which is what performance management is all about. So there's a series of steps we're going to take to reduce overhead cost, increase productivity. We're going to increase productivity, and as a result, we're going to have fewer general government employees. Just like I have 14% fewer employees than I did, comparing 07 to 011, we had 14% fewer employees, and I still have fewer people than I did when I became AG. Because, of course, the most expensive thing we have are people. So we have to be really economical in how many of those we employ.
You think ought to have a separate education budget?
No, because education is already clearly the paramount duty of the state. We just need to prioritize it the way it hasn't been prioritized over the last 20 years.
At this point, sorry, David,
go ahead.
question. At this point, you seem to be extrapolating what you've done in the AG department to the whole government.
Well, in terms of the basic management philosophy.
Based on that,
sure.
Performance management and healthcare costs are probably going to elicit some kickback from the federal unions. Now, if you do get that pushback, are you willing to take them on to push your program?
We're going to bargain to implement performance management for represented employees, and we're going to order it for all non-represented employees, which I can do by executive order as soon as I take office. It's a good system. It's a sensible system. And I'm sorry that the current governor hasn't already done that. She just hasn't required it. Just like she and her predecessors haven't required competitive bidding. They've said, well, we won't put anything up for bidding for this competitive process unless you, the union leaders, approve it in advance. Well, guess what? They don't approve it, so they haven't utilized it. Yeah, there will be some pushback. At the same time, you get what you bargain for. If you don't even ask, you're clearly not going to get it, and that's why we don't have it for most agencies.
When you filed the lawsuit over health care, it obviously got a clash with the Democratic governor and her opinion on that. What some would say the opinion of a large percentage, especially the biggest city in our state.
Yeah.
So what about you philosophically? Do you say to liberal Seattle or liberal Bainbridge Island on this side, or the Democrats that vote over here, what do you say that here's where I'm at ideologically, I can still represent you? How do you answer that?
Well, first of all, there were plenty of voters throughout the state who really disliked the individual health insurance mandate. Maybe they understand what the administration never wants to tell people, which is that it isn't just a tax on people who have no insurance. It's a tax on people who don't have the right kind of insurance as determined by federal regulators. That's what they're doing. They're going to take away people's insurance choices. If you're a small business owner and you're trying to self-insure, not self-insure, but insure with a catastrophic policy, because that works for you to self-insure for $10,000 and then have catastrophic above that, they won't let you do it. They're reducing choices for people, not increasing them. They're reducing the competitiveness of the marketplace for insurance products, and I think that's the opposite direction of where the public wants to go. They want more choices. They want a national market for health insurance, not a state-by-state market. And the mandate goes entirely in the opposite direction. Secondly, what I say to voters in Seattle is the same I would say to voters anywhere, which is we've got unacceptably high unemployment. Increasing state control over the economy isn't the answer. Making it easier for small businesses to hire people is. We have a completely unacceptable situation where the people in charge now have gotten us under a court order to adequately fund our schools, which we already know we're supposed to do. And they insist that we still can't adequately fund our schools unless they have a series of tax increases, even though they're also projecting large increases in revenue. In other words, they're saying, we want to keep doing what we've been doing with the money we know is coming. Oh, and if you want to fund our schools adequately, you have to give us new money. Okay, the voters are not going to accept that. That's ridiculous, and it flies in the face of what we know we should be doing, which is to put the kids first. So the message of economic growth and of funding our schools and of reforming and innovating in our schools is a winning message everywhere in the state, including the city of Seattle. And I know that because we're actively campaigning in Seattle. Unlike other Republican campaigns of the last 20 or 30 years, we have not ignored Seattle. We have an office there, we doorbell there, we phone bank there, we're at community events, we hold events there all the time, because it turns out people in Seattle care just as much about schools and good education and funding it adequately as anyone else, of course. You know, I believe, frankly, that it's a mistake for any elected official on a statewide basis to not pay close attention to Seattle, because I don't believe our state can be successful unless Seattle is successful. It really is the crown jewel. And so whether it comes to transportation or you know, including freight mobility, or you're talking about education or any of these other issues, Seattle is hugely important and will be the main economic driver of our state for the foreseeable future. So I'm going to be a governor for Seattle just as much as I'm a governor for Bremerton or Washtenaw. I just like saying Washtenaw, that's why I use it.
You practiced it, so you want to use it. Got a question, Robert? Oh, one last one. We're getting close to the end, so I want to.
Does your opponent have a program like this laid out?
Absolutely not. Nothing remotely. He says we're going to use lean manufacturing techniques, and we're going to create jobs. We're going to, you know, and that's going to do everything we need. It means it's just rhetoric. You know, the fact is that he's supported by the very people who have deprioritized education, and there's no reason to think that's going to change. And he's going to come right in, and he's going to have that election night conversion if he wins, say, oh yeah, I guess we do need tax increases after all. Because he's saying, if you listen to his language, he's very careful. It may sound familiar, actually. He's saying, I'm not proposing them. Just like Governor Gregoire said, I'm not proposing them. But of course, the legislature is waiting to pass them, and then he'll sign them. I mean, that's just fool me once, you know, that whole saying. So
will you veto tax increases if the legislature passes them?
Yes. You know, the transportation package is going to go to the voters, so that doesn't need to come to my desk at all.
So you're comfortable with sending things
because
to the voters?
Because it's voter approved. Yeah, absolutely. Just like I was when I was in local government. Absolutely. And I'm not opposed to tax revenue growth. You know, in fact, I'm banking on it. But I think the voters have been very, very clear that tax rates are high enough. Tax rates are high enough. In fact, what really frustrates me when I hear legislative leaders and the governor saying, oh, we've got to have tax increases to fund our schools, is they're effectively saying we're not going to fund our schools adequately. Because the voters will just cut the taxes, or business will launch a campaign. I mean, what really struck me about this, really crystallized this in my mind, was in 2010, when the voters on the same ballot rejected an income tax by nearly 2-to-1, reinstated a 2/3 voting requirement for tax increases by the legislature by the same margin. And just to make sure Olympia wasn't, just to make sure Olympia was paying attention, they repealed a temporary tax on soda pop and bottled water. You know, and what else have they done? Over the last 10 years, they've eliminated the motor vehicle excise tax, replaced it with $30 tabs. They've put a limit on property tax growth. Voters are saying, look, we like having good government, but we can only afford so much. How many families expect their income to grow 36% in the next 8 years? How many small businesses think their revenue is going to go up 36% in the next 8 years? Voters are saying you've got to live within your means too, and we will, and that means putting education first.
What about, and I'll just make this the last one.
Sure.
Just to touch with the levy swap again, that's kind of a structural change to what you're suggesting.
Yeah, I mean,
are there other structural changes with our state's tax system that you would be interested in pursuing, or at least starting to talk about?
You know, I'm willing to have a conversation with the business community if they want to rethink how the B&O tax is calculated. That's a zero-sum game, right? But it does penalize low-margin businesses. It penalizes new businesses. But of course, some companies like it. You know, some big companies prefer a B&O tax to a net profits tax. So I'm willing to sit down and have that conversation. What makes it really hard to do is that you have division within the community of those taxpayers. But we can certainly sit down and talk about it, and I think it would be reasonable to do that.
We'll give you just 1 minute if you want to. If there's anything we missed, maybe the closing statement.
I think we covered all the big topics I was hoping to get into. I particularly appreciate the chance to talk about public schools, reform and funding in higher ed, and I think we covered the other issues pretty well. But if you think of anything else, you can always contact us, and I can give you some more thoughts. And we have a ton of stuff on our website as well, all the white papers. So thanks for giving me a chance to go into some depth on these topics. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Thanks so much for the time. Thanks.
David. Thanks. Good to see you. Thank you.